Well, it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Michael for a little while, and then we're going to do something that Michael is particularly good at, and that is he's going to engage you in a Socratic dialogue for a little while before you get a chance to quiz him on his ideas and point of view on economists, the economy, what's happened to our societies and to our world. So I'd like to begin, if I may, Michael. Your audience may very well know that you were brought up mainly, I think, in California, which is a great place to be brought up in, although you were born in another part of the United States, educated at Brandeis, and then at Oxford you were a Rhodes Scholar there, and stayed on for your doctorate. And you were supervised for your doctoral studies by Charles Taylor. And the first question I wanted to ask you was, what influence still persists from your time talking to Charles Taylor, in your views?
Well, I had a wonderful time at Oxford, and Charles was at the center of a small, but to me compelling, group of heterodox moral and political philosophers who stood outside the then mainstream of purely analytic philosophy, which was largely in those days utilitarian. It was in the mid and late 1970s. John Rawls had just, a few years earlier, written his book, A Theory of Justice. Charles Taylor had just written a big book on Hegel. And Hegel was a kind of countercultural figure for Oxford philosophy. And so I was fascinated I was trying just to figure it all out for myself. I came late to philosophy. I had studied politics as an undergraduate. So I was first enticed, almost forced, to study Kant by Alan Montefiore. And then after I had done that, with Charles, I studied Aristotle and Hegel, and then with Stuart Hampshire, Spinoza. All of which thinkers, in a way, were countercultural, at odds with the mainstream. I found it all fascinating, and to make a long story short, the influence that this had on me was to question some of the, I came to think, overly individualistic assumptions that informed contemporary moral and political philosophy, including that of Rawls, and also to question the idea that justice and debates about justice and rights can be neutral with respect to substantive conceptions of the good life. So I suppose, in a phrase or two, those were the influences that I took from that rich philosophical brew, and which continue to shape the way I think about these questions.
It's so interesting you say it. We were contemporaries at Oxford, in fact, and I was doing work in analytic philosophy, people like Michael Dummett and Peter Strawson.
Oh, yeah.
And we were conscious of the fact that Charles Taylor and others were doing the sort of thing you've just described. And I have to say, we all thought that was rather, off the edge. So we didn't go along to those seminars. And here we are with your influence and the considerations that you brought to bear. It looks as though that strand really is flourishing now, rather more than the other strand that some of us were involved in. So that is interesting. I was fishing a little bit. I know you don't like the label communitarian, but of course that is a label that's associated with Charles Taylor's views. You did mention something there a bit about the non-individualistic or overly individualistic view of things. But this is tremendously important because a large part of what you've thought, especially in talking about the sort of marketization of our society, not just our economy, has really been a lament for the loss of the sense of community. So there is a sense in which the label, even though you don't quite like it, and I'd like you to explain why you don't like it, but does somewhat describe the position you're coming from, and it would be a kind of Charles Taylor sort of position.
Yes, the reason I'm a bit uneasy about the communitarian label is that it's sometimes thought to stand for the idea that whatever values happen to prevail in any given community at any given time are the right ones, or the ones that should be enshrined in law. And I don't think that. Communitarianism, in that sense, is sometimes assimilated to majoritarianism, and I'm against that. So that's why I hesitate to embrace the term. But there is a sense, you're quite right, that it does fit, not in the sense of majoritarianism, but in the sense of suggesting that it's not reasonable, it's not possible in some cases and not desirable in others to try to reason about justice or about rights or about the good society by bracketing or stepping back from the particular identities that shape me or that shape citizens generally. And so one of the big points in dispute with what's often called the communitarian position and a Rawlsian position is, well, I described the conception of the self that I thought underlay the idea of justice being neutral toward the good. I described that as the picture of the unencumbered self, the idea that for purposes of moral and political reflection, especially about justice, we should abstract from, set aside, or bracket our particular communal and cultural attachments. And so, and I argued instead that our identities are defined in part by the communities that we inhabit, the histories that shape our lives. So in that sense, I suppose I should plead guilty to the communitarian label.
Well, independently of labels, the point that we can't disencumber ourselves of where we're born, when, in what community, with what conventions and attitudes we're surrounded by in society, that point, it was a point that you urged against the Rawls idea that somehow you could abstract from that and then think about how you would like to see society organized if you were ignorant of where you would be in that society.
Right.
And your point is that you just can't start from there. You've got to start from the fact that we are located.
Yes.
And this is a theme through a great deal of what you've written and said. And it naturally enough raises questions in the minds of those who do have an interest and a concern in conceptions of autonomy, individual liberty, and the rest, that they lie in some tension with the idea that we are already connected and, to use a wonderful word coined by Bishop Berkeley, embrangled in society.
Embrangled.
Embrangled, wow. It's a great word, isn't it? So we have all these connections. Now, how are we going to parlay deal with that difficulty, really, of course identified by Berlin, that there seems to be an unresolvable conflict between, on the one hand, the interests that individuals have in their own lives and projects and so on, and these commitments that they cannot escape from because somehow they're necessitating.
Yes. Well, this is a question that goes right to the heart of what's often called the liberal communitarian debate. And I want to say first off that I'm very much in favor of rights and in favor of liberty and freedom. The question is how to define our rights, the rights that matter and that should be protected, and how to define what it means to be free. And I would say that, take the right of freedom of speech. There are some who say that the moral basis of freedom of speech rests on the idea that government should be neutral with respect to the content of people's speech and simply respect the fact that it is the speech of a freely choosing self. I would put the case for freedom of speech differently. I would say freedom of speech deserves special protection for two reasons, neither of which depends on the fact that the speech was chosen by a freely choosing independent self, but instead, first, on the idea that respecting freedom of speech is essential to democratic life, and democratic life matters, not just because it satisfies individual preferences, but because it makes us better. It enables us to develop our human capacities more fully if we participate in self-government and deliberate about important public questions. So you might say it's a defense of freedom of speech which rests on a certain picture of the good society and even of civic virtue. And the second reason goes beyond civic virtue and suggests that we are free when we actively participate in public deliberation and develop the full range of our human faculties. So you might call this, and maybe you would find this slightly worrying, an Aristotelian-type defense of freedom of speech, because it does refer, and here I'm trying not to evade a possible disagreement, it does refer to a certain conception of the good life, and even maybe a certain conception of virtue.
Mm-hmm. I'm all for Aristotle.
Okay, all right, so that's all right.
That's okay.
Okay.
But there is an interesting point here, which is that the way you set that up went like, I think I caught this, that the reason that central civil liberties like freedom of speech really matter is that this makes for a good society. That if people are fully participating, they're well informed, and they take part in the conversation, that the society as a whole is going to flourish as a result.
And they will be better.
And they, as individuals, will
yes,
be better. Okay.
Both.
That is an important thing to add in, because there is a question of direction, isn't there? Some people could read Aristotle as saying that the good society, it matters that society should be a good society so that individuals within it can flourish. In other words, the direction of emphasis is towards the flourishing of the individual, the good life of the individual on the one hand, and you need a good setting for it. Whereas the other direction of emphasis would be, let's accord citizens these liberties so that the society can be a good one. Now that might be something that somebody who did accept the communitarian label might think. And I'm just wondering which direction are we moving in with you?
Right. I see those two considerations as reciprocally constitutive.
That's a very good phrase, by the way.
Mutually dependent. Yeah. Because the way in which, just to go beyond that piece of philosophical slang, the way in which participating in self-government helps the individual is not just that it's an instrument to enable each individual to have a say and therefore get what he or she wants from public policy. The activity itself, it seems to me, is character building. This is why I said it was Aristotelian. Character building in the sense that certain human faculties are developed when we actually share in self-rule, and when we concern ourselves with public affairs, and when we take responsibility for the fate of the community as a whole. We exercise human faculties that would otherwise lie dormant, that it's not the kind of thing, as they say on some advertisements, don't try this at home. It's not the kind of thing we can do at home.
Now, I'm very sympathetic to that view, and I would want that view to be right, but I can hear two different kinds of critics responding to it. And both of them would say that there is an asymmetry here between the individual on the one hand and society on the other. One kind of critic might say that the best kind of society from the point of view of individual flourishing is the minimal society. So this might be your bog standard Republican who wants small government to get out of the way of the individual and let the individual get on with it.
The Tea Party.
So this is not a liberal conception, it's a libertarian conception which has its own problems. And then in the other direction, you might say that a good society is one that compensates for the failures of the individuals in it. You know, famously, everybody knows what Churchill said about democracy being the least bad of a lot of bad systems, but he also said that the strongest argument against democracy is 2 minutes conversation with any voter. And it's a very potent argument, that one. And he
might have said 2 minutes conversation with any politician.
Well, he could do. Even better, indeed. But that suggests the compensation that a good society has to make for the failings of the people who are not sufficiently well informed, not sufficiently altruistic, not interested in enough in their neighbours, and so on. So you see two different kinds of criticism, which might say this reciprocal constitution that you're talking about could fail in either direction.
It could. I think the real test about what kind of view of liberty one adheres to is whether one thinks that politics and political participation has as part of its rationale to form our characters and to make us better than we would otherwise be. Not just to get us what we want, but to make us better than we would otherwise be. And that's why I admit that this account of liberty does rest on a contestable account of human flourishing and of virtue.
Well, that's very interesting. We must come back at it, of course, because in your discussion of what money can't buy, the marketization of society, you end by pointing out how corrupting of our civic values and of our corporate life, if you like, or community life, it would be if everything had a price and everything could be bought and sold. So,
right.
So we'll come back to that in a minute. But just before we do, the motivation for a good deal of what you say in that argument is predicated on the disenchantment you have with economics and economists.
Yes.
So there may be one or two in the audience, so perhaps you could explain to them what it is about them that's made you fed up.
Some of my best friends are economists. Before, I told you, I mentioned earlier that I came late to philosophy, and when I started graduate school, I didn't even know that I was in graduate school. I started out thinking I would do PPE and study economics and philosophy, since I'd studied politics before. And my project in economics was to see whether it was possible to include within the economic models and those social welfare curves and graphs that they draw a concern for equality, or whether equality as a normative consideration had to be brought in from outside those models. That was the question that interested me. And I was very interested in welfare economics. And I think that, so I strayed from that project, admittedly, though I feel I've come back to it in a way now, 35 years later. In the old days, at its origin, back with Adam Smith and the classical economists, economics was understood, I think rightly, as a branch of moral and political philosophy. In the 20th century, economics established itself as an autonomous discipline and presented itself, and this is how economics is largely taught today, as a value-neutral science of social life and human behavior. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to view economics as a science. Now, when economics concerns itself with traditional economic topics, such as prices, inflation, unemployment, how to avoid recessions, foreign trade, banks, stocks, finance, that kind of thing, traditional economic subject matter, then it's easy enough to see how it's possible to conceive, or may be possible to think of economics that way. But when, as it's done in recent decades, economics enlarges its ambition and undertakes to explain the whole of life, then I think it's less and less plausible to think that economics could possibly be a value-neutral science. And the main reason, and this is what I tried to develop in the book, is that when economic reasoning and markets govern not just things like toasters and flat-screen televisions and cars, but family life, personal relations, health, education, civic life. When economics tries to explain and to inform every domain of life, then it has to enter into morally contestable choices, though it does so often without fully owning up to it. And so I think we've, I would put it this way to any economists in the room, and I hope there are some. Economists often assume that markets are inert, that they don't touch or taint the goods they exchange. And this may be true enough if we're talking about material goods. If you give me a flat-screen television or sell me one, the flat-screen television will work just as well either way. But the same may not be true when it comes to using market mechanisms or cash incentives, for example, to motivate young students to study harder, cash for good grades or high test scores. Many US school districts have tried this as an experiment. In Dallas, Texas, they pay 8-year-olds $2 for each book they read. Now, the motivation is a good one to try to elevate economic performance. And from the standpoint of standard economic analysis, the only test is, does it work? Does the number of books read increase? What actually happened is the grades have not increased in most of these experiments. In Texas, those 8-year-olds did, when offered the cash incentive, read more books. They also read shorter books. But the real question is, what lesson is being taught by offering cash for grades or studying? And the worry is, my worry is, that the lesson being taught is that reading is a chore, a kind of piecework to be done for money. And if that's the lesson that's being learned, then the cash incentive, the market mechanism, is not neutral. It changes the meaning of the activity and crowds out attitudes and norms that we care about, namely, that young people learn to study and to read for the love of it, for the intrinsic good, not for the sake of making money. And once it's seen that markets and market mechanisms and cash incentives can sometimes change the meaning of the goods in question by corrupting or disturbing or crowding out attitudes and norms that are central to those practices, then it's clear that deciding where markets belong and where they don't is a normative question, not just a matter of efficiency. That's what I'm sorry, that was a slightly long address to the economists sitting in the room.
There are many things in what you just said there. One of them, by the way, is a slightly dismaying realization that if the children read shorter books, it shows that an assumption that economists make that we thought was wrong, namely that we are rational agents, is actually proved correct by that example.
Maybe they should offer more money for war and peace.
Yeah, yes. Well, somebody
15 pounds, maybe. How about
somebody may say that those who would only read for money will at least read. And those who would catch fire when they read, it won't matter in the long run whether they've been paid for it or not. I mean, I can hear that kind of argument, and we'll grant that.
Okay.
But I think
and if they do catch fire, and if the higher motive is not crowded out, but triggered, then I would say, okay, let's try it. But that's the question we have to ask, and to know whether to ask that question, we have to be able to identify, as you just now implicitly did, the higher motivation. Yeah. And identifying the higher motivation is a normative question, not just an economic one.
Agreed. Now, I suppose if a social science restricts itself to being purely descriptive, that wouldn't be a problem. What you were saying there was that, in fact, economics does something more than that. Firstly, that it licenses certain kinds of behavior. The complaint that you leveled, for example, against the whole idea of carbon offset and trading of pollution. Right. says it's okay to do this. It gives license to pollute, actually, if somebody else is doing it and you pay them to do it. So
Right.
that would be a serious problem. I think that is an aspect of your argument which is very powerful. But it's also the case, isn't it, that however much economics tries to portray itself as value neutral, it isn't. Because another thing that you're concerned about, and you talk about in the book, is the fact that that economics assumes that consenting adults are the parties to these deals that they make with one another. Right. So if I want you to advertise my book and I pay you enough to have it written on your forehead,
right.
One of the examples is you
it is
tattoo
advertising.
Yeah, tattoo advertising.
Yeah, it exists. This is not made up.
Yeah, it exists. So that would be an example where the question arises, is the person who's rented out their forehead for this purpose truly a free party to the deal? Or are they coerced by their economic circumstances?
Right.
Is this a forced decision that they've made? And this is something that makes you anxious, obviously.
Yes, there are two things that make me anxious, and two questions I think we need to ask, to take the tattoo advertising example. By the way, one advertising executive said, tattoo advertising is actually, it's a good idea. It's not altogether novel. He said, it's a bit like the old sandwich board, but a bit more organic.
Which has the merit of being true.
but there are two objections that I would raise. One of them is exactly as you say. We need to ask whether the people entering into these deals are truly acting voluntarily, or whether they are, in effect, say they're desperately poor, are they in effect coerced by the necessity of their circumstance? This is a question that arises in debates about whether there should be a free market, a free global market in organs for transplantation, kidneys, for example. One objection that's often raised is that if impoverished Indian peasants, desperate to feed their families or to send their children to school, feel the need to sell their kidneys for the lack of any alternative, we might question the sense in which this is a truly voluntary free exchange. So that's one objection. But I also worry on another independent ground, and that is that even if it is voluntary, rather than the result of economic desperation, there is still the further question about whether the tattoo ad on the forehead is degrading. It's a question that arises classically in debates about prostitution. There's the worry about coercion or implicit coercion, but even if that objection is met, there is the further question whether it's morally objectionable because it's degrading. And the argument from degradation or corruption is one that I think is often run together with the argument about coercion. And one of the points that I stress in the book is that these are actually two independent objections that we need to concern ourselves with in deciding where markets serve the public good and where they don't belong.
Now, obviously, the coercion objection is much more straightforward than the corrupting or demeaning.
Yeah.
You say in the book that somebody who has a tattooed advertisement on their forehead is diminished or demeaned by this.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of people have tattoos in all sorts of parts of their bodies voluntarily, and they think that this is an enhancement rather than something demeaning. So is it something about the fact that there's a commercial transaction, the fact that they're, physically bruiting abroad somebody else's product? What is it exactly about it? I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate
yes,
here.
Yes, of course.
I'm wondering whether you couldn't imagine some rather gung-ho chap thinking this is a bit of fun. I could have Coca-Cola on my forehead and be happy about it. Why is it demeaning? Is it a judgment that we might make about somebody who had voluntarily tattooed themselves with, scroll figures and pictures of beautiful ladies?
Or one's boyfriend or girlfriend.
Yeah.
It would be different. I confess, this is just a personal prejudice, I'm not wild about tattooing. But I do think there's a difference if it's a kind of recreational or artistic expression, or an expression of love for and devotion for a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a spouse or a partner on the one hand, and if it's a commercial deal. One of the examples that I came across, I hadn't heard of tattoo advertising until I was reading and gathering materials for this book. There was a woman who needed money, a single mother, who needed money for the education of her son, and she auctioned off space on her forehead to any company that would pay $10,000 for a permanent tattoo. And the winning company was an online casino. Now, I do think, I mean, wouldn't you agree, Anthony, that there is something morally troubling about her carrying for $10,000?
There's something troubling about her intellectuals, I have to say.
Well,
barking mad to have chosen to.
Barking mad to have done it.
Yeah.
But doesn't that make us uneasy in a way that an artistic or recreational or decorative tattoo of the kind you described doesn't? I do think there's a difference.
I agree that there is a strong intuition in that direction, but it exacerbates rather than solves the problem, which is that some of the examples you give in the book, like paying somebody to wait in line for you, for example. You choose an example where you can pay somebody to wait in line for you for a congressional hearing.
Yes.
They can wait all 48 hours or something, and then you turn up at the last minute and there's your place in the queue.
Yes.
And somehow, because it's for a congressional hearing, it seems worse in a way. But this doesn't do anybody any permanent harm. This is somebody who might need some money. I mean, you're conscious of the fact that there would be lots of arguments which say some things seem to be okay, some things don't trouble us as much as others, some like that, for example, or renting your womb for surrogacy.
Right.
These things are troubling. And certainly people who are coerced into sex work, and you know, that's deeply troubling. But it's not always easy to draw a line. Drawing a line involves certain kinds of value judgments. And then the inevitable question arises, whose values?
Right.
Now, I take it that part of your answer is it's got to be our values. So somehow we have to reinvigorate a discussion, a conversation that we have in society about what's acceptable and what isn't. And so the big question is, how the heck do we do that?
Yes, fair enough. And it is true. What makes the argument from corruption or degradation more difficult than the argument from coercion is that it raises precisely this question: whose values should inform us in figuring out what's degrading and what isn't? And I'll come to that, but I'd like to do it through the use of an example you mentioned, the paid line standing, or the paid queue stand. There are companies in Washington, D.C., by the way, that lobbyists can go to, and the company, one of them is called linestanding.com. And the companies hire homeless people and others with time on their hands to stand in these queues, to sit in on congressional hearings, even on Supreme Court arguments. When the Supreme Court held arguments a few weeks ago in a big case, the same-sex marriage case, of course, everyone wanted to hear the oral argument. And there were enormous queues, and there were companies that hired. A lot of people toward the head of the queue were paid line standers. Now, you mentioned in passing, Anthony, that maybe it bothers us because it's a congressional hearing. I would say that the objection to paid line standing does involve the degradation argument, the idea of it being demeaning, but not in this case necessarily demeaning of the person who has the job. Here it's different from the tattoo or the surrogate mother, but demeaning of the institution of representative government that allows this kind of ticket touting, in effect, to govern access to Congress or to Parliament or to the Supreme Court. So there is an argument from degradation and corruption, but what's demeaned, I would say here, is not the line stander, who may simply be doing a job, and it's not an intrinsically degrading job for the person. But one argument against permitting it, I think, is that it's demeaning of representative government to put access up for auction in this way. It's also unfair. That's a separate argument. We worry if lobbyists dominate and get all the seats in the hearing room. But independent of that problem, it's degrading and demeaning, arguably, of the institution. Whereas, you said, well, maybe it depends what the line is for. I think it does. Oftentimes, there are paid line standers and ticket touters when the latest Apple iPhone goes on sale. We've seen these long queues, and people pay to have someone get them the first new iPad or iPhone. I do think that's different, because that's a commercial product. Or even to ticket touting or paid line standing to get a ticket to a Lady Gaga concert. Institutions of representative government are different, relevantly different, I think, from iPhones and Lady Gaga concerts. Now, you'll then say, okay, but that restates precisely the question. That's a value judgment. Yes, I agree, I confess, it is. But, and you rightly want to know, well, whose judgment should govern? And I would say, well, ours, but the hard question is, how should we reflect on those values? And my answer to that may not be entirely satisfying, but I think it's, though partly unsatisfying, the best and the truest answer. If we take the argument from degradation or corruption seriously, as I think we have to, if we're to define the moral limits of markets, we have unavoidably to reason together in public about the right way to value goods, whether the goods at stake are the integrity and dignity of the human person or the proper way of governing access to institutions of representative government. And we carry on those arguments, partly by analogy. Is it more like a Lady Gaga concert or more like Congress? And partly by recurring to the principles that inform those intuitive judgments. And so we go, seeking a kind of, to try to arrive at an alignment between the reasons we would give in behalf of this or that value judgment and the way we decide the cases and respond to the cases.
Now, there's an obvious connection between your concern about, your interest in the concept of justice on the one hand, and these issues. In fact, I see a connection between this book, What Money Can't Buy, and your justice book, where you use as a hook the example of price gouging after the hurricane, after Katrina.
Yes.
Where prices went absolutely sky high for things like ice, for example. People's refrigerators had broken down, they needed ice. The prices of it just shot up sky high. And questions about what's just have always been front and center in the great moral arguments. I mean, you mentioned Aristotle, you find it in Hume, you find it in Mill.
Yes.
I mean, it is a moral matter, and these political concerns, which justice at the center really, are therefore inseparable. So, is it ultimately questions about forms of justice, and what I would like to explore with you is what you take those to be. Is it distributive? Is it some other conception? It's not a Rawlsian fairness conception, but is it some idea of a justice which makes a society a good society, one in which these sorts of things don't happen because the value judgments you make can be sort of firmed up by a strong and agreed sense of justice? Is that how it works?
I think in part. I think justice is an important virtue of social institutions. I don't think it's the only virtue. There are other virtues to do with community, fellow feelings, solidarity, self-government, the scope for and the quality of public deliberation, which may have some bearing on justice, but may also have some independent moral importance. So one might say, well, then there are, broadly speaking, two considerations in evaluating a given society. To what extent is it just? And then to what extent is it a good society that is informed by worthy ideals apart from justice, beyond justice? I think that's a rough and ready distinction, but I hesitate to see it as a very clear and thoroughgoing distinction, because part of my argument in the book on justice and also in the book on markets is that we can't really discuss these two sets of questions entirely independently of one another. What counts as a just society unavoidably embroils us in questions, so I claim, of virtue and the good life. And what counts as a good society, what counts as realizing the common good, can't altogether be separated from whether the distribution of income and wealth and power and opportunity in that society is fair, even recognizing that fairness isn't the only thing that matters.
Well, of course, being just is an Aristotelian virtue,
Yes.
which is other regarding, and it may motivate you to behave towards other people in a way that would inhibit you from tattooing their foreheads and treating them in that way, treating them as
Even if they agree?
Even if they agree, perhaps, you might take the lofty view that sometimes you have a better sense of what's in their self-interest. I don't know whether that might be possible. Well, now, in a moment, you're going to do your Socratic interaction with the audience. Just before you do, I'd like to ask you one more thing, and this is slightly off topic, off this topic, and that is this. Your lectures on justice at Harvard, of course, famously have become available to everybody in the world online. And I think they've become part of the sort of massive open online course that is now available for people to take. And these MOOCs, as they're called, MOOCs, look as if they're going to transform higher education worldwide. And analogous, I suppose, in a way to the fact that developing countries have been able to leapfrog, one level of technology, having the infrastructure for a telephone system, because there are now mobile telephones, so they don't have to build that, and that's a great advantage. And you can see how the internet and television can be transformative of education in that way. But there has been a pushback on two fronts. One is that these massive courses, if they have tens of thousands of students taking them, and they do essays or papers and they send them in, there just aren't enough professors to go around to mark them, so they're graded by software which has been developed to do it.
Right.
Apparently you can send in your essay and get an instant grade, and then you can revise it and try and get a better grade and so on. And it's all being done by the computer. So there's one question mark that pops up in people's minds. Being taught by a computer, is that okay? Then the second thing is that you've been challenged just recently by an entire philosophy department at San Jose University in California,
right,
who said to you, you're just about to put us out of a job, they said, because if our college just has your lectures online, they won't need us, and this effect on higher education might be rather bad. And I know you replied in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and you said that wasn't at all your intention. But this must prompt some thoughts. Where is higher education going, given that this kind of thing, and you are now the sort of exemplar of how successful it can be, that this way of delivering higher education is now with us?
Well, thank you for laying out that full range, the full picture, including the recent controversy. We put as an experiment, a few years ago, before the MOOC revolution, as an experiment, we put my justice course online and on television and made it freely available globally as an experiment in open access, just to see what would happen and to see what might be the educational uses of this new technology. The effect was beyond anything we could have imagined. They tell us that tens of millions of people have been watching them, and for me, the most exciting part of the experiment, the most rewarding part, is simply providing free and open global access to the Harvard classroom or any classroom, so that anyone, anywhere, including someone in an Indian village or in a remote part of China or Africa who has access, insofar as they have access to the internet, can see it and can hear about Aristotle and John Stuart Mill and follow the lectures, engage in the online discussion if they want to, contribute to that discussion. For me, it's a way of giving expression to the idea that public education, higher education, should be seen and treated as a public resource, not as a private privilege. That's what I had in mind, and that's what we experimented with. Now, as you say, many, many universities are experimenting with MOOCs, as they call them, massive open online courses. And the pushback comes when people say, if you allow this to be licensed to our university, especially when public universities are under pressure, as many of them are, financial pressure, they say our administrators will have the students watch these lectures and will relegate us to teaching assistants who lead discussions and who grade papers. And that will wreak havoc with departments and put massive numbers of faculty members out of work. So that's one worry, along with the automated grading. When we put this on, we had to create a system of assessment. And the people at MIT who are collaborating with Harvard are very enthusiastic about artificial intelligence. And they say, we can develop an algorithm. You give us some already graded papers about Aristotle or John Stuart Mill, and we'll figure out an algorithm so that the machine can grade it. I doubt that they will be able to do that. I really do. And I also sort of hope that they won't be able to do that. And so I said, no, we're not going to do that. The other solution to this massive grading is peer grading. And they say statistically we can show that the peer grading isn't all that different from the grading that my teaching assistants do. But those experiments have been done with courses on electronic circuitry and computer programming, not in courses of philosophy. So I'm skeptical of both of those systems of computerized grading. And so what we did in the end, since we had to provide a means of assessment, we had a team of very smart philosophy graduate students and political theory graduate students develop quite sophisticated, old-fashioned multiple choice tests that grasp not just who said what, but how do you reason with the concepts and apply those concepts. And imperfect though they are, they're not as good as essays to evaluate. They're better than the high-tech computer-driven form of assessment, I think. But as far as the pushback, I think I would emphasize that I don't think, however good it is, that an online course can replace the experience of students and teachers gathered in person, deliberating together as part of an academic community. I don't think it can replace that. And I hope that even financially pressed colleges and universities won't assume that it can. It can be a resource to be used as the faculty member feels appropriate, I would say, but it should not replace the local faculty member or professor. And I hope it doesn't. But there has been this pushback, and the debate has just begun.
Well, I suppose the next decade will tell us how it all pans out. I can't help thinking, by the way, that originally the concept of artificial intelligence was that the computers would be artificially intelligent. It now looks as though they're making us artificially intelligent.
I like that.
Conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Marvellous discussion.